the moment when the civil rights movement reached the art world, which was actually quite late in the game. Roughly 1968 was when the first artist protests began to take place against the major museums. The book describes and analyzes the strategies used by African American artists to gain access to show their work and the responses that they encountered from museum administrators and trustees as both wrestled over power and control. The book's narrative begins in 1962 with a youth empowerment program that some of you may be familiar with, right here in Harlem, called HARU, and later HARU Act. The HARU Act program actually led to the concept of the Studio Museum in Harlem, because the students in that program were actually going down to the Museum of Modern Art to see art. And so the idea arose, well, why isn't there a museum in Harlem for these kids to visit, in addition to going down to MoMA? And then, as many of you know, the Studio Museum was opened in 1968. The book goes on to present a series of case studies that chronicle artists' efforts to integrate the major museums in New York City. And I focus on the Metropolitan Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, and the Whitney Museum. The artists were also protesting, to a lesser extent, the Brooklyn Museum, but I focus on the New York City museums because of that very interesting overlap in the roles of the trustees of those museums and the political world. Many of the people who were on the boards of trustees of those museums were also very involved in government, Nelson Rockefeller and the Rockefeller family being the prime founders of the Museum of Modern Art. I conclude the book by outlining the outcomes of this very important period of activity, intense activity, roughly the years 1968 to 1972. I'm going to tell you what I believe the outcomes were. I believe there were three. First, the major museums, what some call the mainstream museums, but which I'm going to call the major museums, to challenge, of course, that notion of mainstream versus margin. The major museums devised strategies to showcase artists of color, but in contained ways. These ways included things like small galleries off the lobby of the museum. The Whitney did that, for example. Or galleries that were placed in the museum's restaurants. I see some head shaking. The Museum of Modern Art did that. So these were strategies of inclusion that I think of and I call segregation in the guise of integration. Another one of these strategies was the identity-based exhibition that separated artists of color from whites. The second development was a vast increase in education programs for what we now call underserved audiences or underserved constituencies. Back then, those groups were called culturally deprived. Yes, they were called culturally deprived. We now call them underserved constituencies, which constituted people of color as consumers of dominant art history, challenging the limitations of that dominant history, which would have entailed recognizing artists of color as cultural producers and not just cultural consumers. The third development, and perhaps the most important, was the proliferation of what are called culturally specific museums, or what many people are now calling culturally grounded museums. These are organizations that serve specific constituencies. The Studio Museum was one of the first, if not the first, and the proliferation of these institutions was aided by the advent of new public funding, the creation of the New York State Council on the Arts in 1960 and the National Endowment for the Arts in 1965. Now, these organizations provided significant places for art and artists who had been historically excluded from the major institutions. But at the same time, they institutionalized the existence of separate venues for different groups of artists. Now, this began in the late 60s It really grew in great numbers in the 1970s, and now we see it at the national level with the creation of the new National Museum of Afro-American History and Culture, which is going to be opening this fall. We saw it with the creation of the American Indian Museum, and there is a movement to create a Latino museum, which may take as long as the National Afro-American Museum, and if that's the case, it'll be 10 or 20 years until we see that happening. The period of foment in the 1960s and 70s that led to the creation of separate institutions for separate constituencies is the moment that we are still inhabiting. That the structure of the art world as we know it today was produced in the crucible of the 60s and institutionalized in the 1970s. But first I'd like to tell you what the major museums were like until the late 1960s. And I'm going to use the Metropolitan Museum as an example of the social milieu, which was one of exclusivity and wealth, like a private club. There were no African American staff members except maintenance staff. There were not even at the Met African American security guards during the late 1960s, although at MoMA there were. Photo documentation proves that there were. My interviews subjects told me that African Americans would literally be turned away at the door at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They would be told that the museum was indeed a private club. And the trustees treated the museum as if it was their own private club. They could borrow works from the collection and hang them in their homes. And when they went on holiday for the summer, they could park their art at the museum, where it would be safely, the art that they personally owned, where it would be safely guarded as it hung in climate-controlled galleries. The museums would call this their summer loan show. How many of you remember the summer loan show? Attempts to engage with the civil rights agenda often backfired. Due to a number of factors, by the late 1960s, it was becoming socially unacceptable to voice racial prejudice. But it was not socially unacceptable to voice an investment in the status quo. Why should we change our institution? This is who we are. This is our history. This is our past. If we do something different, we will no longer be who we are. And so I think that one of the greatest obstacles to change was this profound investment in the status quo. When I interviewed Benny Andrews, he said to me, up until the 60s, the gallery system would have X number of artists, established artists, like 10. Those artists very often decided who the one or two young artists would be to come in, like protégés. And then they would be nourished and they would become the next group. And for the average person, average artist, there was no way to enter unless you got literally what the slaves got, a note from the master to come in. You go to a gallery, and if you didn't know some famous artist, they'd wonder, why are you there? The art criticism was just as impossible to deal with. You just sat there like you sat waiting for the morning paper to come. And those criticisms were either devastating or they made you. The gallery dealers and curators just looked to what the critics were saying. So I'm going to now begin with the protests at the Metropolitan Museum of Art against a very important show called Harlem on My Mind. On the night of January 16, 1969, 36 artists staged a protest outside the Metropolitan Museum of Art on New York City's Upper East Side. The occasion for the protest was the black tie opening of the Metropolitan Museum's exhibition, Harlem on My Mind. As partygoers made their way inside, sporting tuxedos and evening gowns, members of an activist group called the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition and their supporters marched back and forth along Fifth Avenue, bundled in overcoats and gloves, handing out leaflets that read, "Souls Been Sold Again," and carrying signs that called the museum's director, Thomas Piet Hoving, Massa Hoving. The protesters opposed what they saw as the misrepresentation of African Americans in this large exhibition about the social history of the Harlem neighborhood in New York City. The show's contents included documentary photographs and newspaper texts presented in the form of slide projections, photo blow-ups, audio tapes, text panels, and videos. Exclusive use of journalistic media implied that African American artists had no place at the Met. The protesters' leaflet read, "Black people, puzzled and anxious to learn of their heritage and of some meaning in their lives, can find very little enlightenment in this fantasia." The artist mocked the show's white organizers as, quote, "the latest experts on the Black experience," close quote. The protest marked a turning point. According to Lowry Stokes Sims, a longtime curator at the Metropolitan Museum, and as many of you know, was the director of the Studio Museum from 2000 to 2007, Lowry has said, "The reaction against Harlem on my mind is comparable to Woodstock, the March on Washington, and all these large manifestations that really gave people an inkling of their entitlement and their ability to make change within institutions." The artists jolted the Metropolitan Museum out of the past and brought the civil rights movement to the museum's front door. Photography had been shown in exhibitions and collected by museums since the beginning of the 20th century. Yet, as the artists pointed out, the Met had never done any exhibitions of photography, not even exhibitions of photographs by white artists. The museum's acceptance of photography as an art medium would not be formalized until 1992 with the establishment of its photography department. As a socio-documentary exhibition of photo reproductions and media, Harlem on My Mind didn't make sense within the logic of an art museum. Looking back, even staff members who were directly involved with the project were vexed. As Harry Parker III, who was the museum's working museum director's office at the time, recalled, "Here it was, an exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but it ignored African American art, which was amazing. I remember thinking how stupid we were to ignore art when here, that's the medium that we're theoretically the most interested in." When the show started to come together, why weren't any of us out there saying, "Well, aren't you going to include some art? This is an art museum." So the show was controversial. It was protested on a daily basis. It made the front pages of the New York Times. It's a very interesting story that has a lot of different threads that come together. One very positive outcome of this debacle was the formation of the activist group that I mentioned earlier, the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition, which was led by Benny Andrews and artist Cliff Joseph. And after it became clear that these artists weren't making much headway at the Metropolitan Museum, they turned their attention to the Whitney Museum of American Art. They turned their attention there because, as Benny Andrews told me, that was the museum that defined what American art was. The artists got together. Their ranks had expanded through the protests. They had over a dozen people meeting on a weekly basis, and they had many more who would turn out for their protests. And they began a series of negotiations with the director of the Whitney Museum. At that time, it was Jack Bauer. They had several demands. They wanted increased acquisitions of artwork by African American artists. They wanted a gallery devoted exclusively to African American artists' work. They wanted an exhibition of actual artwork by African Americans. And they wanted that exhibition to be either organized or co-organized by someone who was extremely knowledgeable about African American art and the African American experience. Now, they did not actually come out and say that the curator had to be a Black person, and this is what would have made the difference, having a curator who was knowledgeable about this subject matter. As it turned out, the show was not put in the hands of an African American curator. The artists were told some of their demands were actually met, and why were they met has to do with the availability of public funding, and in order to show that the museum was reaching a diverse audience and was fulfilling a public mandate in order to qualify for the funds from the New York State Council on the Arts, the National Endowment for the Arts. They did agree to certain of the artists' requests. So what I'd like to talk with you about is this concept of the Black Art Show, which began to, it actually has a history that goes back to the 1930s. It is not only an artifact of segregation, it was a choice that was made by the Baltimore Museum in 1939 when they did one of the very first shows of work featuring African American artists. It was a Black art show. There had been a show in the 40s at the Brooklyn Museum. And in the late 1960s, this became a very popular model of exhibition practice. The model redressed the exclusion of African Americans from the dominant institutions while simultaneously perpetuating segregation. In the 1960s and 70s, the term Black art was employed by some African American artists to describe their own work in a spirit of self-definition. The identity-based art show maintained a literal physical separation between artworks by African Americans and other artists, particularly whites, rather than dealing with the artwork in terms of its content or any other complicated thing that it might be involved with beyond simply the notion of identity. Some artists embraced the term Black art, but others found it constraining. Many were ambivalent and caught in a double bind. They wanted exhibition opportunities, but they did not want to be marked as other or pigeonholed by assumptions about their aesthetic interests. A common misperception in the 1960s was the idea that true African American art always addressed racial struggle or contained obvious visual references to African forms or what were construed to be African forms. Another misconception was the equation of African American art with a particular style, ranging from primitivism to social realism. Well into the 1990s, the notion persisted that African Americans were more inclined to create figural rather than abstract art. So I want to read to you a letter that was written to the curator of the exhibition, Robert Doty, by an artist who some of you may have heard of, who's actually had a lot of visibility in the last few years, Barkley Hendricks. So Barkley Hendricks, for those of you who don't know his work, it's relatively realistic. And the curator of this exhibition, Robert Doty, had done a show of realist work. And when Barkley Hendricks found out that this curator was doing a show of Black art, he was a little disappointed that he hadn't been considered for the show of realist art because he considered himself a realist. So he wrote to Robert Doty, "Dear Mr. Doty, a fellow artist informed me your museum is planning a Black artist exhibition in the spring of 1971. I would like to be considered as a possible exhibition candidate. I have shown at the major museums and galleries in Philadelphia. My work can be seen at the Kenmore Galleries in Philadelphia, where I'm represented. I would like to be considered for any other future exhibitions. I'm especially interested in future exhibitions. I'm especially interested in future realist exhibitions." So this letter to me suggests Hendricks' willingness to participate under any rubric, even a Black art show, but his more pointed eagerness is to be featured in an exhibition that had an aesthetic premise rather than an identity-based premise. So I am going to end with the last paragraph of the book. As the United States moves toward a minority-majority population, major institutions that deny vast horizons of human experience will find themselves no longer major. What, after all, is the purpose of art, if not to communicate through visual, visceral, intellectual, and emotional means the range and complexity of what it is to be human? No single group has a monopoly on the ability to produce forms with meanings that echo with the deepest secrets of human experience. And any museum that claims to be universal, yet offers only a sliver of human experience, denies not only the artists who are excluded or tokenized, but also the public for whom museums claim to exist.